First of all, thank you for inviting me. Prosenjit has kept the contact with me during the whole time, making sure that I don't forget that I'll have to come. And then also thank Vishwarup for the introduction. Before I start the actual talk, I have one confession to make. Usually I tell my students that if you give an 1 hour talk, don't write more than 20 or at most 22 slides. Now in this case, as you see, I have 32 slides, so I have violated my principles. And partly it's because of Vishwarup, because I wanted to give this talk on the measurement of length, which is something I have done before with different audiences. But he was very keen that I include mass also. And then when I started with length and mass, then I thought, okay, why not time? So I included that also. So that means that I have more than what I feel comfortable with. And there are several options with me at this point. Either I skip some of the slides, or at least do not do justice to some of the slides. Or the second option is that I speak very fast so that you can understand what I am talking about. Or the third option, I just take as much time as I need and don't care about it. I'm not sure which option I will take at the end. I'll determine it dynamically. If I see many people falling asleep, then I'll probably go for the 1.5 hours, because anyway they are asleep and they won't mind. But if I see people are awake, then I will try to take probably the first option and not the second one. Okay, so that is the confession. And now I really start. As I said, originally the talk was supposed to be measurement of length, so most of the time it is a measurement of length talk. And the three things are dealt with at different levels. The measurement of length, I sort of go from the beginning to the end. Measurement of mass, I just take a few highlights on measurements of mass. And measurement of time, just two things, the smallest time and the largest time. So the first thing is the measurement of length. I cannot imagine that anybody who has seen the title of the talk hasn't had a feeling of surprise. What is he going to talk about? What does he have to say on measurement of length? Measurement of length is, in a sense, so trivial that the thing we measure things by, we don't even call it an instrument. I mean, look at this. This is the measuring instrument. We don't call it an instrument at all. This has to be the most trivial thing that one has to do, yet we'll see that there are some interesting aspects and aspects that once you hear, you will think that, oh, we knew about it, but at least I didn't know about many of these things some time ago. So let's see. We start with this beautiful measuring instrument. What does it have? It doesn't have anything except for some tick marks on the piece of cloth and some numbers written on them. So if we want to discuss this measuring instrument, the only thing that we can discuss is that where do the tick marks come from? So where do the tick marks come from? Well, the simple answer is there is somewhere another piece of such measuring instrument where there are tick marks. So if you want to set up a meter scale, you just have another person's meter scale and just copy the meter on your scale. But that only brings the question that where is that person got the meter scale and so on and so on. And so really the question is, how were these units, the measuring unit, defined? I think here what you are seeing is a measurement probably in inches, it seems, but I am going to talk about how the metric system came into being, how the system was imposed. So in early times, the human body was used to set up the units. Even now we have units like foot, we have units like cubit, cubitum means elbow in Latin. So from that, the distance from the elbow to the tip of the fingers is called cubit. In Bengali, for example, we still have hath, which is the hand, and I'm sure there are similar units in other parts of India and elsewhere. The problem with these units was the problem of standardization. When you say foot, whose foot? And in fact, if you see the measurement of foot, it's very hard to think that it was somebody's foot really. But probably the measurement was taken from the feet of kings or big warriors, and probably not the bare foot with some shoes, etc. So that was the measurement. But as I say, these things were hard to standardize, and that's why there were different standards maintained at different places. And it's a very interesting thing if you read Newton's Principia. I'm not suggesting that you read the whole thing, but if you read the first page, you will see that he is saying that all the measurement in this book will be made in the London foot, which is different from the Birmingham foot by this amount, and from the whatever names of other cities in England. Liverpool foot by this amount, and so on and so forth. Okay? So every place had a different definition of feet. Around 1760, in France, a person called Gabriel Mouton suggested that we should set up a unit of length related to the measurement of the earth. Because there are many feet, but there is only one earth. So if you use the earth to set up the scale, that would be unique. So he suggested that the length should be whatever length subtends a 1 degree angle at the center of the earth. 1 degree along a great circle, of course. If you calculate it, that turns out to be something like 2 kilometers. That is too big. People want something which is comparable to their body size. Okay? But well, if you, instead of taking that unit, if you take 1,000th of that unit, that will be 2 meters, which will be comparable with your body size. But in 1790, the French Parliament approved the idea of the measurement, and in about 3 months later, in August 1790, Louis XVI, the king, gave the task to the French Science Academy. Now, in 1791, in 19th of March, the Academy produced its report and suggested that the unit of length be a quarter of the circumference of the earth divided by 10 to the 7. So why 10 to the 7? 10 to the 7 because just what I said. With the 10 to the 7, the unit would be comparable to a human body. Now that means that they already knew the circumference of the earth. How did they know? We'll come back to this question later. I have some comments like this. They are like homework problems, if you think. I mean, this talk is at the level of classroom lecture. So there will be some homework problems you expect. So those are these things. Now, the Academy was very careful. When they said circumference of the earth, they said it's the circumference of the earth along the longitude which passes through Paris. They're very careful. Okay, so the measurement started shortly afterwards, and in 1791, in June, the king, Louis XVI, convened a meeting to assess the progress. And this was probably the last meeting as his being the king of France. The next morning, he had to leave the palace, and that was the end of kingdom in France. So the measurement actually started. What they thought is that they would measure the distance from Dunkirk to Barcelona. Dunkirk is just a little bit to the east of Calais, as you see, and this longitude passes right through Paris, as you can also see. So if they measure this much, they will not have to measure the whole 1/4 of the circumference, because they already knew the latitudes of the two places. So again the homework problem, how did they do it? Okay, maybe this homework problem I will tell you the answer. You probably have guessed, many of you have guessed, magnetism was already known at that time, so they could know the latitude from the tip of a magnetic needle. Okay, now the experiences were spine chilling and I did not go through them. They, just looked like a very big novel, because the revolution was going on in the country and they were measuring with these instruments. So sometimes there will be, the soldiers from one side, the king's side would come and say, what are you doing? I said, we are measuring the distance from Lahore to Barcelona. I said, that makes no sense. You must be the spies of the other side. And then they would put them into custody. And then somehow they would come out and to be captured by the other side, who would have the same. So this way, so they took much longer than what they thought they would take. And the measurements were completed in 1797. But already in 1795, based on some provisional reports, a standard unit was agreed upon. When in 1797 the actual report came out, they just made a little correction to that thing. And so what did they do? They made a standard meter length from an alloy of platinum and iridium. And that has been kept in a place called Sèvres near Paris, just a little bit to the northwest of Paris. And that has been there since, even now. So the homework question is why platinum and iridium? But then what they did is that they said, okay, now this is the standard meter. Now they invited other countries to come and copy the standard meter so that they can have prototypes of the standard meter in every country. And one of the things that the government does, the government has a weights and measures section, is to have a standard meter for their country. Okay, so that people can, probably the standard meter is not so much that you use, but sometimes in the market they come with the standard kilogram and they see whether the sellers there, they have their kilograms, which is the same as the standard kilogram. This is what is done with the standard. The countries were invited to copy the length. And this is how the meter was established. Let us now try to go down to smaller scales. How do you measure smaller lengths? And by the way, I should say that when I use the word length in this context, I don't really distinguish between length and breadth and width and these kind of things. Length means anything which is a distance between a point A and point B, whatever it is. So, the size of small objects were typically determined by using lens systems. You make some lens systems so that you get a magnified image of the small object. And the microscope was invented in 1590, so with that people can make measurements of cells and so on. It was a big boost to life sciences because they can actually do measurements. Can one build more and more powerful microscopes to see smaller and smaller objects? The answer is no, because once we go below the wavelength of light, we cannot use the light to see anything. We'll come back to this question later, but now let us ask the question that, okay, then what is the limit? The limit is the wavelength of light, right? So how was the wavelength of light measured? And this is one of the huge ironies in the history of science, that the wavelength of light was first measured by a person who did not believe that light is wave. And this person's name is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, after his Principia, he started doing experiments in optics, and one of the things he did is this, which all of us learn in our college or university textbooks. He put a convex lens and shone it with some light, some monochromatic light, And then what he saw is something like this. And we call these things Newton's rings. So, how are the rings coming? And Newton's didn't have a good explanation. What he observed is that the bright and the dark part of the rings depend on the thickness of the portion between the lens and the mirror. And then he actually measured it and found that the thickness of the layer to create successive bright rings are something like 4 divided by 178,000 inch. So this and its multiples, you get bright rings. And if you have trouble with this number, I have converted it into more friendly numbers, which are 5.7 times 10 to the minus 5 centimeter or 570 nanometers. So what Newton measured actually is the wavelength of the light that he was using. Now, in the 19th century, of course, wavelength of light was measured through many experiments, interference experiments, all of them were in some way or other. So the same basic technique, but used with different apparatus. Now what do you do when you want to measure the lengths smaller than the wavelength of light? Well, one requires shorter waves. So for example, when you wanted to measure atoms, fortunately the X-rays were discovered, or let's put it another way, because the X-rays were discovered, you could actually measure the atoms, and the wavelength of the X-rays were smaller than the interatomic distances. That is why you could measure the atoms. Now if you want to go even further down, then it's difficult to obtain electromagnetic waves of even higher and higher energy and in a good amount. So scientists started using charged particles, that is matter waves, instead of electromagnetic waves, as the probe. The advantage is that the charged particles can be accelerated easily, so they can be made more energetic. And this is the reason that scientists wanted accelerator machines to probe smaller and smaller distance. I am not going into the accelerators because I thought that to this audience it would be not necessary. Let's now go and jump to how one can measure the smallest lengths. So let's start from this last statement that I made. One needs high energy probes to explore small lengths. Why? The point is, if we shine an object with some kind of waves and want to see structures smaller than a length, say L, then we need the waves whose wavelength is smaller than L. Much smaller. That is why, for example, you can reflect sound from even a wall, because the sound wavelength is so large that it doesn't recognize that this is not a plane. So you need small wavelengths. Now the de Broglie relation between wave and particle natures tells you that the corresponding, if you think of the corresponding particle, the particle has a momentum which is 2 pi h bar over the wavelength. Then if lambda has to be less than of order L, then P, the momentum, has to be greater than order h bar over L. Forget about factors of 2 pi, etc. They are not important in this discussion. The important thing is that the momentum rises as the length becomes smaller. So this is the answer to this question. But the question is so important and the answer is also so important that we'll come back to this question again. But this is the moral for the moment, that in order to know about smaller and smaller structures, we need to use more and more energetic probes. This is why elementary particle physics is also called high energy physics. Because if you want to know elementary particles, you have to use high energy. Now, as I said, this is very important, so let's do it another way. Suppose we have some composite object whose lengths are of order L. Now, its building blocks are somehow confined within a distance of order L. So if you have an atom, which is, if you want to say that this is 10 to the minus 8 centimeter, then it means that its building blocks have an uncertainty delta x, which is less than that. Okay. Now then Heisenberg uncertainty relation will tell you that the uncertainty in momentum has to be bigger than h bar over L, that order. Okay. Now the momentum itself must be greater than the uncertainty. This is one very important thing. This is something which is almost trivial. Let's say we take the example of this wallet. Suppose you ask me how much money is in here, I don't know. I honestly don't know. Okay. But then you ask me to make a guess, I'll say okay, maybe 500 plus minus 200, something like that. And you'll say okay, that may be an honest answer. But suppose I tell you, okay, maybe it's 500 plus or minus 1 lakh. You are laughing because that's not an answer. So that is the step. Okay, that the actual thing has to be bigger than the uncertainty. Okay. Now the particles must also possess an overall attractive potential energy because they have to be bound. So the total energy must be negative. So the magnitude of the potential energy has to be bigger than the kinetic energy. Now what you need is neither potential energy nor kinetic energy. You need the sum, the total energy. Now the virial theorem tells you that the magnitude of these two things cannot differ by huge factors. So as an order of magnitude, the total energy is the same order as the kinetic energy. For example, if you take the hydrogen atom, you will see that there is a factor of half or 2, depends on which way you are talking about, between the two. Now we need to supply the energy equal to this E total to C at the level of the constituents. Okay. So the E total, the kinetic energy, which is of the order of kinetic energy, has to depend on the momentum. So if the momentum has to be bigger than h over L or something, then this energy will also have to be bigger than something. So this again tells us that if you want to go to smaller and smaller substructures, if you want to see, then you need higher and higher energies. You see, this is just a problem of even seeing the thing. I am not talking about how can you measure up to 3 places of decimal or 12 places of decimal. This is not the subject of the talk. The subject of the talk is how can you even give a number to a measurement. Okay? So for example, if you consider proton, you ask whether does it have a substructure, and you can see substructure of the proton at the level of 1 GeV energies. From this you go to the size with the uncertainty relation, then the size will be 10 to the minus 13 centimeter. So you say that the size of the proton is of the order of 10 to the minus 13 centimeters. The electron, even though we have gone up to 10 to the 3 or maybe even 10 to the 4 GeV, we haven't seen any substructure. So that means that the size of the electron is less than 10 to the minus 16, or if you take 10 to the 4 here, maybe 10 to the minus 17 centimeter, less than that. We haven't seen anything. So you see, it is the uncertainty principle which is doing the measurement of length. For the smallest of the lengths, that is the only scale that we have, the uncertainty principle. Now let us go to something bigger than the size of a man. As I said already, that when the people were trying to set up the unit for the measurement, the meter, they already had some idea of what the circumference of the earth is. So how was the circumference of the earth measured? It was first measured, as far as is known, is by Eratosthenes in, I think, 2nd or 3rd century before Christ. What he noticed is the following. He was from Egypt. What he noticed is the following, that there is a well, quite a deep well in Aswan, and on the summer solstice day, at the midday, the sun's rays fall directly into the well so that the sun's rays reach the bottom. This is the observation. Now then he says that, okay, then I will go to Alexandria, which was much to the north. Aswan is along the Nile River. Alexandria is on the Mediterranean. And there, the sun rays are not reaching the bottom of the well directly. So he can actually measure the angle between the vertical to the ground and the sun rays coming. And from that angle, and from the distance that he knew between Aswan and Alexandria, he could find the radius of the earth. So the remarkable assumption here is that he assumed that the sun rays are parallel. That looks trivial now, but at that time, he knew that the sun is very far away. This was non-trivial. This is a great thing. What did he find? He found that the radius of the earth is 252,000 stadia in some units that were used at that time in Egypt. How good is this measurement? We don't know. I'm not sure what a stadia means. Okay? But it must have been not bad, because this is the measurement, or this kind of measurement with some refinements are the things which are used at the time of the French Revolution when they set up the meter. And the idea was definitely very good. Then came, about 100 years later, the measurements of Aristarchus. Aristarchus was definitely the greatest astronomer of that time. So he took this system of the sun, the moon and the earth and measured different positions at different times. Let's see, what did he measure and what did he find? First, he looked at the moon when the moon is half full. So half full means it's like this. So the lighted part coming from the sun is this. So he said that now this angle of this triangle, the angle at the moon, that must be right angle. Again, if you have missed the brilliance, let me point out to you. He knew that the only light that moon has is coming from the sun. This is highly non-trivial. Okay. Anyway, so he said, okay, this is the right angle. So now if I measure this angle that I can measure from the earth, I look at the moon and I look at the sun, and again I add a little footnote that the moon and the sun are not visible at the same time in the sky. So this requires some effort. Okay, but if I can do this and I can find this angle, then I know the angles of this triangle and therefore I know the ratios of the different sides. So what he found is that this angle is 87 degrees and therefore the ratio of the sun's distance to the moon's distance is 19.1. Now actually the angular measurements were not very accurate at that time, and as I said, it's not direct measurement also. If you actually put in the modern numbers that we know for the sun's distance and the moon's distance, then the angle should have been something like 89.85 degrees. So anyway, however good, however bad, he has a number for the ratio. Now he thinks of the solar eclipse. Okay, this is the sun, this is the earth. It still looks green, although the way we are going, maybe in 100 years it will look grey also. So I have put the grey for the moon. And let's say the distance from earth to moon is dm and earth to sun is ds. So there are these similar triangles, and from these triangles you conclude that the radius of sun divided by the radius of moon, this is the radius by radius, is the ratio of these two things, which is the distance over the distance. And that is also the reason why the sun and the moon roughly appears as the same big circle in the sky. Okay, so this is his input. Oh, by the way, in this input, he assumed, of course, one thing, that when total solar eclipse happens, it happens only in a very small region on the Earth. Okay? So if you want, you can also add the Earth's radius with it. That will just make the calculation a little bit more complicated, but the idea is this. Now, what happens at the time of the lunar eclipse? This is the sun, and now the Earth is between the moon and the sun, and so the Earth's shadow falls on the moon, and it doesn't stay for very long. Total lunar eclipse doesn't stay for very long, so he assumed that the shadow actually grazes the moon and meets somewhere here at a distance x. Of course, you cannot measure x, right? We are not here, but from the similar triangles again, he can get this kind of relation. Rs over Re, the radius of the sun divided by the radius of the Earth, is equal to the ratio of this distance, which is sun's distance plus moon's distance plus x, and divided by similarly dm plus x. And there is another similar triangle. From that you get another relation. Now he has already some inputs. He had this, the ratios of the radii is the ratios of the distances. Okay. So from this also he knows some ratio between ds and dm, as I showed, that 87 degree thing. Okay. So then he found x from these two, and then it was known, the value of Re, the radius of the Earth, was known, that is Eratosthenes, that I just talked about. So from this now you can determine everything. So you know Rs, you know ds, you know dm, everything. Everything is known. So this was the measurement of the distance to the sun. This distance was very much improved by Cassini in the 17th century. And this is one tour de force of measurement. What he basically measured is the distance between the Earth and the Mars. The Mars is obviously the red planet, that is why you see that color. And let's say the distance from the sun is d sub e and d sub m. I used the m before for moon, now it is for Mars. Okay, so in this picture, what he measured is this distance, dm minus de. Now if he can measure that, motivation is that the ratio of de over dm was known since Kepler's time. Because Kepler said that the t square has to be proportional to the distance q. So he must have known the ratios of the distances. And this is the next homework. What data did he have to conclude that t square is proportional to dq? I'll not answer this question. Now, what Cassini did is that he sent his assistant, Jean Richer, to Cayenne. Cayenne is in South America. It's the capital of the French Guyana. Now, in 1672, there was a time of confluence. Confluence means that this was in the same line. Okay. So then, at the time of the confluence, they both observed the Mars at midnight and noted its position in the sky. How do you note a position in the sky? You just see some star near it, and they say, okay, this is at so much distance from this star, and so on. And now, what happened is that they both have this data. And Richer came to Paris. This is the most difficult part of the experiment because this took about a year. It was not easy to come from South America to Europe at that time, obviously. Now, what Cassini did is that now he knew which star Richer saw near Mars at that time. So he said that, okay, so at that time the configuration was like this. From Paris, Cassini was seeing the Mars near the star S2, let's say, and Richer has told him that from Cayenne, Mars was near the star S1. So what Cassini now did is that from Paris, he measured the angle between the stars S1 and S2. That means he measured the angle beta. Okay? Now look at this triangle. Beta and gamma are two angles and alpha is an exterior angle. So alpha is equal to beta plus gamma. Right? But gamma must be very, very small, because these are stars which are very, very far away. So neglect gamma. So alpha is equal to beta. Okay? So now you know alpha. You know the distance from Paris to Cayenne. This came as a surprise to me. That in 1672, they knew the distance from Paris to Cayenne. I don't know how. But anyway, they certainly knew it with a very good accuracy. And because these things are far away, these two sides, the PM and CM, they can take roughly to be equal. So if you do that, you can actually solve this triangle and you can find what is the distance PM, or equivalently, what is the distance CM. So that's the distance between the Earth and the Mars. And once you know that, you know the ratios. And so you can find both the distance of the Sun from Earth and from Mars. So this is two in one experiment. You get two things at the same time. So this is how the Sun's distance was measured in 1672. The modern method is close to it. The modern method is not very close to Cassini's method, but close to Aristarchus' method. Aristarchus' method, you remember this, he made a right angle triangle with the moon, the sun and the earth. You do the similar thing, except not with the moon, but with Venus. So you see Venus when it's sort of just beginning a retrograde motion. See, suppose the Venus is going like this, okay? So from the earth, you will see in the sky that the Venus is moving like this, and then at some point it is turning back and moving like this. So at that time, when it's beginning its retrograde motion, you see Venus. And therefore this angle must be 90 degrees. So this angle you can measure. The advantage over Aristarchus is that this angle will be much bigger than the similar thing with the moon, because Venus is far away. And so you just need one distance to know the other distances, and that distance happens to be the distance between the Earth and the Venus. That you can do just by sending a radar signal and getting it back. You cannot do it with the Sun, because the Sun will just absorb the radar signal. Okay. So this is how you measure the distance to the Sun. We all know the distance, how much is the distance to the Sun from our childhood, but how it's measured turns out to be not such an easy question with an easy answer. How do you find the distance to the stars? Well, it's like what Cassini was using. Cassini was using basically parallax. I didn't use the word before, but it is parallax. I mean, suppose you see a star here, and these are the other stars which are supposedly much further away from this one. So then after some time you see that this star has moved in this background. So then you can measure the distance. But the distances are now much bigger. So Paris to Cayenne distance is no good for measuring these kind of distances. So what you do is that you use the orbital motion of the Earth. You see the star from here, and then 6 months later you see the same star, and you see what is in the background. Okay, so then you know this angle, and you, of course, assume that these two sides are the same. They don't look very same in this picture, because actually this thing should have been far away, a few kilometers away if I had drawn it to scale. So the difference is negligible really. And you know this side, this is twice the distance from the Sun to the Earth, which we have already measured. So then you can actually solve the triangle, and therefore you can get the distance to the stars. The only problem is that the stars are actually so far away that apart from some few stars, this angle is so small that is impossible to measure with any good accuracy. So then what do? You see, you just see the brightness of an object. The brightness of an object depends on its intrinsic luminosity, how much energy it is emitting, and also the distance, right? Now, in order to determine the distance, one needs to know the luminosity by some other means. If you know the luminosity by some other means and see how bright it is appearing to you, then you know the distance. Okay? But the question is, how do you know the luminosity? And there are different techniques. For example, for some stars, which are variable stars, their intensity varies, which are called the Cepheid variables. Luminosity has a periodic variation. This is m, this m is luminosity in some logarithmic scale. For students who are in astronomy, you know this is the absolute magnitude. And this p is the period of the star in days. As I said, the period is variable. So Leavitt showed that there is a relation between the absolute magnitude and the period. How did she know that there is a relation? Because she actually knew the distances to some of the stars by the parallax method. So she used those stars to calibrate her scale. And once that is done, now this thing can be used to stars for which we cannot use parallax. We just observe the p, the period, and from there we find what is the m, and then we see what is the m that we are seeing. So from that we find the distance. Basically the problem boils down to finding things for which you know the absolute luminosity. Okay, so one way is to know some other variable which you can observe. Some other things are just finding some what are called the standard candles. Standard candles means the absolute luminosity is known from some theoretical considerations. For example, if you have a type 1 supernova. Type 1 supernova, you believe that it becomes supernova because of merger of two neutron stars. And so, you sort of can theoretically calculate what the absolute luminosity would be, and then you use that and the observed brightness, of course, to find the distance. This was used to find the distances to distant galaxies and to make cosmological measurements, which has actually revolutionized cosmology in the last few decades. We will come back to this later. So that's the end of the measurement of length. And as you see, it's almost an hour already. So my calculation of 22 slides is the correct number. This is as much as you can do for me. Yeah. Okay, let's go. I don't have time to rest. Measurement of mass, as I said, I will not be so extensive. I'll just consider a few cases, some highlights. How was the mass of the Earth measured? Well, you measured the acceleration due to gravity, the small g, and that is given by capital G times the mass of the Earth divided by the radius of the Earth square. This was already known, I have said before. Small g was already known. Okay. So the g times m is what was not known. And as you know, after Newton's laws, Cavendish measured the capital G, but actually I don't think Cavendish was very much interested in measuring capital G. When people ask Cavendish, what is this experiment you are doing? Supposedly he said that I am measuring the mass of the Earth. So this was his motivation, to measure the mass of the Earth. He knew that if he knows this, then the mass of the Earth will be known. And of course, once he measured this, we knew the mass of the Earth. Now, one of the interesting things in this part is that this small g was known. It was actually measured by Galileo. When good clocks even did not exist. Before Galileo, clocks did not exist in some sense. I mean, Galileo was the one who thought that pendulum is periodic motion, right? But Galileo used a very beautiful technique to measure G. I think many of you know it. He just made it an inclined plane. So he reduced G. Okay. Anyway. Oh, sorry. I gave the answer to the question. But some related questions. How did Newton know that the force of gravitation varies at the inverse square of the distance? What data did he have? I will not answer this question. Newton also knew that the Earth's shape is ellipsoidal, it's not a sphere. In fact, he had some theories of why it is not a perfect sphere. Okay? So that means that the measurements were so accurate that they could find the difference between the polar radius and the equatorial radius. How? Questions, homework. How is it the mass of the sun measured? Now this is very easy now. Consider the earth going around the sun, the distance is d, and so you write down what maybe it can be called the Kepler-Newton law, Newton's law of gravitation, but it has the t square proportional to distance cube in here. The mass of the earth cancels, so you know the omega very well, you know what is the length of the year, and now you also know the distance to the sun, and you also know capital G, so you can find the distance, the mass of the sun. But how do you find the mass of stars? Actually, you cannot find the mass of any star. You need binary stars. And the methods are different depending on what kind of binaries you have. The binaries might be visual binaries where you can actually see both stars going around. You might think that, okay, that's the best thing. If I can see both the stars, what can be better? The problem is that you don't know the plane at which they are. So it's difficult to conclude anything. If you have an eclipsing binary, that one star eclipses the other sometimes, then the plane is known. But as you can imagine, you now have less number of such objects. If you have a spectroscopic binary, that is, the two stars are not separately seen, but one can see the Doppler shift of spectral lines from both stars. So this is what you observe in the case of spectroscopic binaries. You see with time the change of the spectral lines, and from that the Doppler shift you infer the velocities. So suppose you see something like this, star 1 and star 2, maybe one of them has a maximum at V2 and one has V1, and let's say that the orbit lengths are A1, A2 and the masses are M1, M2. What we are interested in is finding these masses. So the geometry of the orbit will tell you that the time period, of course you can find the time period, this is the easiest thing you can do. The time period times V1 is 2 pi times A1, assuming of course a circular orbit. Okay. And time period times V2 is 2 pi A2. So you know the time period, you know V1, V2, so you know the ratios between A1 and A2. And then because of the center of mass thing, you have to have A1 equal to M2, A2. So you know the ratio between A1 and A2, and therefore now you know the ratio between the two masses. And now you know the time period, so the time period again, it will have to be Kepler-Newton law. And usually we derive Kepler-Newton law with the assumption that just one mass is heavier, much heavier compared to the other, like the sun and the earth. But if you just do it, it's a very easy calculation. Don't make any assumption about the relative magnitude of the two masses. Then Kepler-Newton's law will just come out with M1 plus M2 in the bottom. Okay? So from these, then you can find M1 plus M2, and you have already found the ratio. So now you know the two masses. So this is how the masses of the stars are measured. Of course, there are many other techniques, like I did not talk about the other kinds of binaries. But now let's go back to a small mass measurement. How was the mass of the neutron measured? How was the neutron discovered? This is one of the very interesting case studies. You see, in 1930, Bothe and Baker bombarded beryllium with alpha. And basically the reaction is the time, this is alpha, plus, let's say this is beryllium, this can be anything else, I don't care really. But what happens is that in the end, there will be a nucleus with Z plus 2 here. So in the case of beryllium, it will be carbon. And this is, if this is beryllium 9, then it will be carbon 12. Plus something. I mean, in these days, this, we can see, if we just see that thing, we will say, okay, this is 4 and this is A and this is A plus 3, so this must have a mass equal to 1 in these units. Okay? But of course, those days it was not known that this will have to be conserved and so on and so forth. So they thought that the radiation is gamma ray. Because it has no charge, it's unaffected by magnetic field, so they assumed that it will be gamma ray. Now Curie and Joliot, this is not Madame Curie or Mother Curie, this is the daughter Curie and her husband Joliot. They showed that this radiation, when it's incident on paraffin, paraffin is hydrocarbon. So basically it suffers some collision with the protons, and then the protons are emitted with kinetic energy 5.3 MeV. So you shoot with this and the protons come out with 5.3 MeV. Now if this has to be done with the photon, you can just do a simple calculation, you will see that you require about a 50 MeV photon. 50 MeV, this kind of energy is not available in a nucleus. Nucleus has few energies, okay, not 50. So it cannot be photon. So then in 1932, Chadwick, he did a beautiful thing. He produced alpha from, I guess this is polonium, 84, and then hit 11 boron. So again, this is, alpha is hitting 11 boron. So now here you will get nitrogen. Okay. And now if you write down the energy conservation equation, this is the mass of the alpha times c square, this is the kinetic energy of alpha, and this is the mass of the boron, this was at rest. And then on the right hand side, you have the mass of the nitrogen times c square and its kinetic energy, that will be very small. And then, okay, let's say that this is neutron, so I'm just for the ease of notation, I'm just writing as Mn. So neutron mass energy and kinetic energy. Now everything here is known except the mass and the velocity of the neutrons. So if you can find the velocity of the neutrons, then you can find the mass of the neutrons. But this is the problem. How do you find velocity of a particle which does not have charge? With proton, electron, etc. it is easy. You just put them in a magnetic field, they will bend, and you will see the velocity from the curvature of the bent path. Neutron. That doesn't happen. Okay, so what he did is very interesting. He found, this is not helium. Okay, he found the velocity of the neutron by letting the neutrons hit a hydrogen target. You see what will happen? This is just like this here. You have a series of pendulums, you take one of them and let it hit. What will happen? Just one from here will go up. If the masses of these things are set, right? This is what happened. So he measured the proton velocity. He measured the proton velocity by seeing the current, in fact. So measured the proton velocity, and from that we found the neutron velocity, and from that we found the neutron mass, and we found that as he had anticipated, the mass is very close to the mass of the proton. So it was not the photon, it is a new particle. I mean, new means theoreticians talked about neutron before, but this is the first time it was experimentally established. Okay, so this is as much as I am going to talk about measurement of mass. Now I go to the measurement of time, and as I already said at the beginning of the lecture, I'll just talk about the measurement of the smallest times and the largest times. So the smallest times, the lifetimes of very, very unstable particles. Let's say we are measuring the cross section of some A plus B going to A plus B, elastic cross section. Okay? And suppose I see as I increase the energy, it shows this kind of behavior. There's a hump. I mean, in the beginning, for small energies, there will be lots of things. But that's not the point. When you go to high energies, then if you see a hump, high energy means high compared to the masses of these particles. So, if you see a hump, then it implies that there is an unstable particle in the intermediate state. So, basically, it's not just simple elastic collision, it's A plus B forming some intermediate state C, and that C is short-lived and the C is decaying again to A plus B. Why do we say this? Because this is the way to explain the hump. If you do it in a quantum field theory way, then with the intermediate C, you will have a propagator of the intermediate particle in your amplitude. And the propagator is like this, the 4 momentum square minus the mass square plus, since this is an unstable particle, you also have to add a term which is I times the mass times the decay width. Decay width is the inverse of the lifetime. Okay. If you have this, then when you mod square it and put it in the cross section, you will get k square minus m square whole square plus this square. If you don't want to think of it in a quantum field theory way, okay, you can also just think in terms of just second order perturbation theory. This is a second order process. Right? This is first order again. So this is second order process. So in second order perturbation theory, there is always an energy denominator. Right? So it's basically that energy denominator that you are seeing here. Now, how will it look? If you just plot this, if there is no other factor, it will be just a thing like this. Right? There are other factors which I haven't written it out. So this hump is actually sitting. This is called the Bright-Wigner thing, right? So the center of the hump is when this becomes maximum, and this becomes maximum when this is 0. So the center of the hump is at the mass of the unstable particle in the middle. And the width of the hump is given by this gamma. So if you measure the width, the half width, or whatever you define in some way, the width, and that will give the gamma, which is the inverse lifetime of C. So that is how you measure the inverse lifetime. You see this hump, and you see the position, the midpoint of the hump, which gives you the mass, and you see the width of the hump, which gives you the inverse lifetime. So this is not just a measurement of time, it's also a measurement of the mass. If you have some particle which lives for a very short time, how do you measure the mass of the particle? Okay? You cannot put it on a scale because the particle is decayed by the time you have put it. So this is the way. And this has been used for many, many short-lived particles. For example, take the delta particle. Delta is a particle which is somewhat heavier than the proton and the neutron, but made up of more or less similar constituents. This width, the gamma, turns out to be in the energy units about 100 million electron volts. So if you take the inverse and put it in the proper units, then you will get a lifetime which is 5 times 10 to the minus 24 seconds. So you can measure 10 to the minus 24 seconds this way. Okay. And this is the way most of the lifetimes in the particle physics is the way it's measured. And you see, this is also the uncertainty principle doing the measurement, because this width is really caused by the uncertainty principle. Since the particle lives for a small time, its energy is not known. You cannot measure its energy up to an accuracy better than h bar over that lifetime. Okay, so the mass is not known, the mass is only probabilistic, and so that is why this width is happening. So it's the uncertainty principle doing the measurement of both mass and the lifetime of the most unstable particles. Now the largest time, the age of the universe. Let's do a little bit of background theory, and this for the first time has some equations but not very important. In standard Big Bang cosmology, you assume that it's homogeneous and isotropic, etc. So then from the equations governing the evolution of the universe, you can actually find the age of the universe, T0, T0, to be 1 over this H0, which is the Hubble parameter, that is the expansion rate, the A dot over A. A is the scale factor. So this is the A dot over A now. And then some integral. You don't have to really look at the integral in detail. The only thing that is important here is that it contains two parameters. One is omega m, the density of matter in some normalized unit, and one is omega lambda, the cosmological constant. I would assume that in this audience, probably everybody has heard about cosmological constant, so I am not going to explain what it is. The important thing is that they have different kind of evolution of energy density, and so they contribute differently to this integral. So there are really three parameters in this equation. One is the Hubble parameter, one is omega m, and one is omega lambda. If you know these three, then you will know what is the age of the universe. So how do you know them? Okay. So first of all, you write down from again the similar background equation, the distance of an object at a redshift z. Redshift is the cosmological redshift, it's the redshift of the lines coming from a distant object. If that is z, then the distance, if the distance is called Lz, then this Lz times this H0 again is another integral which again contains the omega m and the omega lambda. And the z dependence here is first of all here, and then this z, the limit of the integration is z. Okay? And this omega sub k that you are seeing is just 1 minus omega m minus omega lambda. Okay? And this is either sine hyperbolic or sine depending on whether this is positive or negative, etc., etc. Anyway, those details are not important. Now, what you do is that you take many distant objects, and then from this you try to find these values of omega m, omega lambda and H0. How do you do that? First of all, you have to measure the z, because you will put it in here to see the relation between distance and z, right? So you measure z. That is the easy part. Without this, there would have been no cosmology. Okay? You just see the light and see how much the wavelengths are shifted. Now you measure L, the distance, by using some kind of standard cadros. Remember I talked about them before. So what the things that are used are the supernova, type 1 supernovas that I had talked about also before. And so using the type 1 supernovas, you can find the distances. You can find the distances of the type 1 supernovas by seeing their apparent brightness, and then you know what their luminosity is through some theoretical thing, and then you find the distance. Now, if you go to this equation, you see that if this z is very small compared to 1, let's say, then in this integral the z prime is always very small. So this omega m is multiplied by z prime, the omega lambda is also multiplied by z prime, so you can just neglect these things and just find the integral. And from this integral you will get a log of 1 plus z. So for small z, this is just z. This is the original Hubble's law, that the distances are proportional to z. So from this, so if you make some measurements with some small z, then from the slope of the curve, z versus the distance, you can find h naught. And that they found is 63 kilometer per second per mega per second. So h naught is known now. Now you make measurements on far objects also, and you fit your observations of Lz versus z with the values of omega m and omega lambda. So basically you just plot Lz versus z, whatever you found experimentally, and then you see curve fitting, which omega m and omega lambda fits it best. Okay. So from that you can find omega m and omega lambda, and once you have found that, then you put it in this expression, and then you find the age of the universe, and the results that is found by this supernova cosmology project is this 14.3 times 10 to the 9, that is a billion, 14.3 billion years. So that's it. Thank you very much for your patience, and I finish.